And welcome back to The Way of the Wandering Wizard. I am, as always, Robert Andrew Meredith Kennedy, although most folks know me as Bob the Wizard. And I am a pure and open channel for the finest vibrations of divine love and light made manifest here in service to Gaia and those who travel with her. My last little video, I was reminiscing and waxing lyrical of the joys of being a father. Throughout, I've done my best to be as good as dad as I was, and I would spend quite a lot of my evenings walking little Caitlin, and night times, because she would never sleep, round the park. And then leaving the good lady and the little one at home while they were on maternity leave, I would beetle off to work. And one of the greatest joys of working on the training area was the first time in my life that I'd ever been on the same piece of land every day. And I did work, apart from holiday, 6 days, 7 days a week, 2 half days. Watching the seasons unfold on those levels day after day was just joyous. And I became quickly immersed and invested in the land. The bulk of my job early on was picking up rubbish after squaddies and cadets had been training over the area for years. I had my first introduction to who is known as the Mad Major. Though when I first met him, a little bit stammery, but I wouldn't say that he was mad. Similar age to my dad, and I have to say I got on really well with him. A wonderful, eccentric old boy. And we'd get involved in all manner of conservation projects. He started his little missionettes, where he would basically drop me off on the training area in some obscure places with a large-scale map and basically give me routes to track my way through, so that I actually learnt the land. And that's worthy work. I loved it. Out in nature, walking, picking up rubbish, finding new sites, finding new species that I'd never seen before, things that caught my eye. Working on the land, and I just happened to be away, it's a training area. Maybe my observation had picked up, but I found myself really, really enjoying that connection with nature. I've always been a keen photographer, so it was natural that I would take a camera along, take a few shots, if I could, record shots. The Major, being a conservationist and a volunteer on the forest, introduced us to the wildlife experts who worked on the forest, the conservation officers up there who would be happy to help us identify species. And through that link, I started a good, strong working relationship with Ashdown Forest, which would be a part of my recovery later on. I said, what a joy. I'd spend my days, some of the days, busy, chatting to soldiers, working out what they wanted to do, making sure that their exercise didn't conflict with another's exercise. And then I'd be on my own, literally walking around with a litter picker in hand, miles from anywhere, nary a sound, apart from the distant gunfire of training troops, all blokes I listened to. It was a great summer. I absolutely just fell in love with the site, fell in love with my job. I had a few interesting moments, clearly having mentioned in the last one, cleaning toilets. On site, these were old-fashioned, what they call a long drop toilet. Now, if you can imagine the Portaloos at Glastonbury put on an epic scale, I mean, like a tank that you could, should you be mad enough, climb into. In fact, the reason why he was called the Mad Major was on one occasion as he stripped off to his underpants and jumped into a pond to recover various pieces of rubbish that he saw floating around that he didn't want in there. Well, I had to deliver him back to camp, clad in a towel and his underpants. He would also have a habit of wanting to climb inside the long drop toilets, wearing little more than white disposable suits, in order to make sure that there was no rubbish in those. And it was at that point that I decided that I really wasn't paid enough to be swimming in excrement, and also would prevent him from going down there with all kinds of concealed spaces. He had a little chainsaw, and so in order to make sure that he stayed safe with his little chainsaw, they sent me off on my chainsaw training. Now, I'd used a saw since I was a child through the Scouts. I'd certainly used it a lot on the farm, and a lot of my farming experience, the fencing work that I'd done with my father-in-law over the long years that I've been associated with the family, certainly came in useful. Went off, learned how to maintain a chainsaw properly and how to cross-cut trees. That was it. What better job? Out clearing the occasional wind-flown branches that had fallen across tracks, picking up after soldiers, just generally being on the ground. The site was rich in nature, rich in history. Well, my first year in the forest, or first half a year of the forest, was coming to a conclusion. It was almost Christmas. I'd settled into the job, I would say. And I was called back to the camp. A delivery driver had stupidly decided to take his truck off of the concrete roads on the track or on site, and had promptly buried his rear axles in the mud, as I had a 4x4. Would I come down and extract his vehicle? Now, vehicle extraction was a daily part of the job, to be honest. Squatters quite often went off tracks and things. So I'd become a dab hand at recovery and self-recovery. In order to aid the recovery, they'd basically taken the load off the back, a large component of one of the boiler houses. I don't know, basically a large tank that was sitting on a pallet. I managed to drag the vehicle out, thinking no more of it. And the plumbers crew that were fitting the part basically asked me if I wouldn't mind, if I wanted 20 quid in my hand, if I'd give them a lift, carrying said boiler up into the boiler house. It wasn't a huge distance, and 4 of us, we reckon we could lift it. So the delivery driver, having obviously caused the problem, got hold of one corner, the plumbers, and I got hold of the bottom edge. Now, in moving this rather large load up the slope, we got to a point where it was quite heavy, and the delivery driver promptly announced it was heavy and let go. Being downslope, with bulk of the weight coming towards me, my foot slipped, and over I went. Once again, that resounding pistol crack running through my body, and I now had a broken left leg to add to my extensive breaks of my right arms and my left arm. I was pretty much underneath the pallet. I knew that it had gone. So, swearing profusely, although I was slightly downslope, they had to lift the pallet off my foot. As they lifted the pallet, I slid backwards with my foot flopping. Now, at the time, there were 2 first aiders on the camp. Yours truly, and the other one was having a day off. He's never forgiven me, really, because he really wanted to put it into practice. So I basically had to self-first aid. Members of staff were called. The ambulance was called. The boss was called. He kindly explained as to why hadn't I done a risk assessment. Yeah, not great. That said, full of gas and air, put up onto the little trolley, and I was loaded up into the ambulance and taken off to Kent and Sussex Hospital. It was quite a little stay. I went in. I'll be honest, it hurt, but it wasn't too bad. So I sat in the A&E bay. X-rays taken. Yes, it was broken. It would need an operation. I sat there quietly, twiddling my thumbs. The good lady came in. And then went again. It came in and went again, and I still hadn't been seen. Eventually, the ambulance crew, almost practically going off shift, stuck his head through the door to see if I was all right. I said, I'm still here, aches a bit. And he said, you better start making a fuss or you're just not going to get seen. So I called the nurse over, and she was aware that theatres have been very busy. It would be too late for the operation, so I'd be taken to the ward. I was on the ward. One of the orthopaedics turned up. Obviously, I couldn't have my ankle flopping around and kindly put it into a cast. All I can remember is him saying, "Are you okay with morphine?" Giving me rather a lot. Me going into drifty unicorn land, Ollie yanked my foot about. Needless to say, the next day, I had an operation. It's a distal spiral fracture for the technically inclined, a nice twisting spiral. And so I ended up with a metal plate supporting both bones in my left legs. And for those of you who can remember the arm shot, there in the wall in the middle, by the swords, are the ankle legs. A life held together with Meccano, eh? Well, in recovering from my operation, clearly the nurses decided that it would be a good opportunity for me to give up smoking. I'll be honest, by the second day I was probably getting a little bit scritchy and critchy. My night had been disturbed by a lovely old lady, bless her cotton socks, who'd spent the night hooting and wailing, and whenever the nurses were called, that they were members of the IRA that had come to terrorise her in the night. Oh, she had a urinary tract infection, a UTI, and it was clearly bothering her. So there was not a lot of sleep that night. On the second night, she'd calmed, bless her, she'd been taken to another ward. And I was just about settled in. Nobody sleeps well in hospital, but I'd just about nodded off. I heard a rustling of the curtains, and as I came to, I realised that the gentleman, and by gentleman I mean a gentleman of the road, as my grandfather would have called them, basically, a homeless person who had a horrendous problem with his leg. During the course of the night, he decided that he needed a wee, and so, unbuttoning his fly, he tried to stand up on his somewhat damaged leg. Losing his footing, he promptly came through the curtains and landed pretty much on me. Cock in hand, still peeing. Now that is not a great awakening. In the morning, having been mopped up, clearly, cleaned, I didn't sleep well. Every rustle of the curtain would have me jerking awake. The pain control nurse asked me if I'd had a rough night, because apparently from that point on I'd been pushing my morphine driver like a deranged woodpecker. Later that day, I did have a little bit of a moment when one of the nurses, again when I asked to go out for a smoke, suggested that maybe it would be a good time to give up. I wasn't very polite. My brother was duly summoned. He promptly put me in a wheelchair, rolled me out into the car park, gave me a couple of smokes, and I was absolutely fine. Back home, the prognosis was that it would be 6 to 8 months before I walked. And if I walked, I would always find it difficult to walk over rough ground. I had a great set of scars on my leg. Everything had healed up, stitches were all out. I was at home. I had a young child. Bless her, she was only 9 months old, so although it seemed like enforced time off of work, it gave me a rare opportunity as a dad to be there every day with my daughter. And they were great times. I'd carry her upstairs in her little baby grow, in my teeth, on crutches, or shuffling up on my lap with her held. When changing a baby while standing on one leg isn't too difficult. It's a bit more difficult when the little angel decides that knocking your crutches over, which are resting on the change mat. Great fun watching Dad then hop off across the room to try and pick it up while she hooted with laughter, bless her. Just a wonderful time of my life. Wonderful time, despite the injury. I was a Reiki master. I'd done my training. I was fit before the little accident, and I was determined to get back on my feet quickly. Concentrating the mind on my healing, I healed quite quickly. In fact, 4 months later, and I was back at work. doing my job pretty much, able to carry load, carry on as normal. I got chatting to the plumber, who basically suggested that as I'd had time off of work and that I'd lost out on overtime, felt responsible, he had insurance, I should claim off it. Really wasn't interested, it was overtime loss, but he was claim off it. And so I put a claim in place.